Welcome to Wine, Food, Flavour. Today we have a talk to one of Marlborough's leading winemakers from Greywacke Wines, Kevin Judd. A big thanks to the wine station here in Blenheim for letting us use their tasting room for the interview.
I'm Kevin Judd, and I'm proprietor and winemaker for Greywacke Vineyards in Blenheim. I was brought up in Adelaide in South Australia. I must admit I wasn't born under a grapevine, so I had no prior experience in the wine industry, but when I left school, one of the options for tertiary education is Roseworthy Agricultural College, or it was back then, and winemaking is something you can study, and it sounded like an interesting job. I guess I was a sort of a science subject, so I was always going to go into an industry, I suppose, that was sort of science-based, but it combines the science and the horticulture and an opportunity to use your own personal taste as to what you produce. My first job was at a place called Chateau Ranella, just south of Adelaide. So I was initially a QC laboratory technician, and then I became assistant winemaker at that place. But then the company that I was working for was purchased by Hardy's, actually, a big corporation, and my job description was about to change quite dramatically in the wrong direction. At that time there was two jobs being advertised in New Zealand, so I applied for them both on the not having ever tasted a New Zealand wine actually at the time, with the thought that it was a new frontier and it was a cooler climate, and I was particularly interested in cool climate white wine styles, and I got one of the jobs and moved to New Zealand. The plan was to come to New Zealand for 3 years. That was plan A, and then go back to Australia, but of course that never happened. I was up in Auckland, and I was making wines primarily from Gisborne and Hawke's Bay for Celacs. I think in 1985 we actually sourced fruit from Marlborough for the first time, but as I said, we were planning to come to New Zealand for only 3 years, and then after a couple of years we were starting to think about going back to Australia, and then I met a guy called David Honan. David Honan was the winemaker and the proprietor of Cape Mentelle in Western Australia. He'd established Cape Mentelle. He'd won the Jimmy Watson Trophy 2 years in a row, and he put sort of Western Australia and Cape Mentelle on the map. As a consequence of that, he was visited by a bunch of Kiwi winemakers in '83, I think it was, who after tasting his wines gave him a bottle of Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, and it was that bottle of wine that sort of inspired him to investigate where it come from. So he came to New Zealand and decided to set up a second wine company, and that became Cloudy Bay. So he offered me the job to make wine for him in his new project. And well, when we established Cloudy Bay in '85, we were the 5th winery. So there was already Montana, there was De Ra, Hunters, and Daniel Lebrun. So we were the 5th winery to establish an actual winery in Marlborough. Back then, the year that we were planting grapes, the government was paying $5,000 an acre for people to pull their grapes out of the ground. There was a big oversupply of grapes in New Zealand, primarily Müller-Thurgau and hybrid grapes, and interest rates were up around 25%, so they were big challenges for a new company. And the world hadn't yet discovered Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, so the whole Cloudy Bay project was based entirely on David Honan's foresight and our collective belief that Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc had the potential to be world class. I was at Cloudy Bay for 25 years, and the company that we started was a little family-owned company. The company that I left was part of the LVMH. There were two different beasts. What I learned in that 25 years was extraordinary, for everything from not just winemaking, but the whole wine industry, marketing, and my approach to winemaking in the early days was very much based on my sort of scientific, my Australian training, my belief that everything had to be squeaky clean and modern technology, and my winemaking these days is more hands-off and a lot of wild yeast and a lot of more sort of old world winemaking techniques. After 25 years at Cloudy Bay, I turned 50, and I decided it was the time to do something else, and so my wife and I established Greywacke 2009, so in the middle of a global financial crisis, which had its challenges. And the year after Marlborough went into oversupply. So up until 2008 there was never enough fruit in Marlborough. 2008 vintage, there was more fruit than anyone expected, and suddenly there was more fruit than companies needed. global financial crisis. So it was a whole new equilibrium in Marlborough at that time, great prices and all that sort of thing. But the one positive for Greywacke is it meant we were able to source some really, really good grapes for our new project because there was an oversupply for the first time ever, really. So at Greywacke, the core of our business is Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir. We make two distinctly different styles of Sauvignon Blanc. One is the more sort of, it's our interpretation of the classic Marlborough style, which is a fruit-driven aperitif, zingy style of Sauvignon Blanc, but we're working very much towards the riper end of the spectrum. We're trying to get some good texture, nice ripe, a more subtle than perhaps average style of Marlborough Sauvignon, and the other we call wild Sauvignon, which is a sort of a left field wild ferment, barrel fermented, very hands-off, some more savoury, more herbal, not so fruity style, more textural. Then we also make a Pinot Noir, grown pretty much entirely from the southern valleys, very fragrant, aromatic style. We do a Chardonnay, which is once again quite hands-off, 100% wild yeast, quite a smoky, nutty, savoury style of Chardonnay, very old world in style. And we make a little bit of Pinot Gris and Riesling, and not every year, but quite often we do a botrytis affected Pinot Gris. It's not super sweet, it's not sort of treacle, but it's around 100 grams residual sugar, so it's luscious and voluptuous without being sort of super sweet, but it's definitely a dessert wine style. I guess people know me mainly as a landscape photographer, and for many, many years I specialised in vineyard landscape photography. But I used to provide images to illustrate various other things that involve portraits. So I've done quite a lot of portraits, but most of my work is landscapes.
How do those skills vary between winemaking and what you take to know them? Two completely different things. How do they complement each other, maybe?
Well, I've been asked this a few times. I've thought about this a bit. I think the primary analogy is that they're both a combination of science and art. I mean, you can't take a good photograph. Well, I mean, you can. I mean, the cell phone's a very clever thing these days, but really good photography is generally a combination of knowing how to use the equipment and having an artistic bent. And winemaking and photography share those things. Other than that, I think the thing about my photography is that it's a very personal thing and it's just me, whereas the wine industry is a collective effort between everything from the viticulturalists through to the marketing and the sales and all the rest of it. So photography is a very personal thing and it's just what I do. For a long time I used to make a bit of a living out of it, published a few books. These days it's reverted to more of a hobby.